I never saw it coming. The text message that would shatter my world arrived on a Tuesday afternoon while I was folding laundry in our Chicago brownstone. I want a divorce. 4 words. 30 years of marriage reduced to 12 characters on a screen. But that's not where this story really begins. To understand how I went from devastated wife to the woman who orchestrated the most satisfying revenge of my life, we need to go back 3 months earlier, to the morning everything started to unravel without me even knowing it. It was a crisp October morning when Marcus kissed me goodbye at our front door on Lakeview Avenue. He was heading to Seattle for what he called a critical business development conference. His consulting firm had been pushing into West Coast markets, and this trip was supposedly make or break for a major contract worth millions. I remember smoothing down his tie, a navy silk one I'd given him for our anniversary, and telling him I'd miss him. He smiled that smile I'd fallen in love with 3 decades ago and promised to call every night. I watched him load his Mercedes, expensive leather briefcase in hand, net worth of our combined assets sitting comfortably in joint accounts I never questioned. The autumn leaves were just starting to turn golden, and I remember thinking how beautiful our neighborhood looked, how blessed we were. The morning air had that particular crispness that only comes in October in Chicago. I stood on our front steps, my cardigan wrapped around me against the chill, watching Marcus's car disappear around the corner. Mrs. Patterson was out walking her golden retriever, and we exchanged waves. Everything felt so normal, so routine. I had no idea that normal had already died, that I was living in the ghost of my marriage without even knowing it. I went back inside and poured myself another cup of coffee from the French press Marcus had gotten me for Christmas 2 years ago. The house smelled like the vanilla candles I always lit in the morning, mixed with the scent of the coffee. Comfortable, safe, familiar. All lies. I know what you're thinking right now. You're screaming at your screen, telling me I should have seen the signs. But here's the thing about long marriages. They become like wallpaper. You stop really looking at the pattern because you've lived with it so long. You assume the foundation is solid because it's been there forever. You don't question the man who slept beside you for 10,000 nights because doubt feels like betrayal of everything you've built together. Marcus had always traveled for business. His consulting work took him to conferences, client meetings, strategic planning sessions all across the country. Los Angeles, New York, Dallas, Atlanta. I'd grown accustomed to his absences, had built my own life around them. I volunteered at the Art Institute, took pottery classes, met friends for lunch at our favorite spots in Lincoln Park. I thought we had a good marriage, the kind that weathers the storms of career demands and finds strength in independence. What a fool I was. That first night he was gone, he called right on schedule. We talked about mundane things. Had the landscaper come to rake the leaves? Did I remember to pick up his dry cleaning? What was I making for dinner? Normal, comfortable, safe. I told him about my day, about running into our neighbor Mrs. Patterson at Whole Foods, about the new exhibit I was helping organize at the museum. He sounded distracted, but not unusual for a man at a business conference. I said I loved him. He said it back. The words were there, but looking back, I realized the feeling behind them had vanished like smoke. I remember that conversation so clearly now, parsing every word for meaning I'd missed at the time. I'd been sitting in our living room, curled up on the leather couch we'd bought together in an antique shop in Milwaukee. The lamp next to me cast warm light across the pages of the art history book I'd been reading. Outside, the streetlights were coming on, casting their orange glow across our quiet street. I'd felt content in that moment, secure in the life we'd built. When Marcus said he loved me, I'd smiled and settled deeper into the cushions. I'd had no idea those words were hollow, that his mind was already somewhere else, with someone else. The second night, he didn't call until almost midnight. Apologetic, rushed, claiming the networking dinner had run late and everyone was still talking deals over drinks at the hotel bar. I was already half asleep, but I remember the background noise, or rather, the lack of it. No clinking glasses, no ambient conversation. Just silence punctuated by what sounded like ocean waves. Seattle isn't known for beachfront conference hotels, but I was too tired to process that detail. My brain filed it away in some dusty corner where ignored red flags go to gather cobwebs. I'd been dreaming when the phone rang, something pleasant I couldn't quite remember upon waking. I fumbled for my phone on the nightstand, knocking over my water glass in the process. Water spread across the wood surface as I answered, my voice thick with sleep. Marcus sounded wide awake, almost energized. At the time, I'd attributed it to the time difference, to the adrenaline of important business deals. Now I know he was probably standing on a beach somewhere tropical, Victoria beside him, both of them laughing at how easy I was to deceive. The thought still makes my stomach turn. By the third night, the calls stopped altogether. A text instead. Exhausted, crashed early, talk tomorrow. Tomorrow came with the same excuse, and the next day. The brush-off became a pattern, but I told myself it was just a demanding work trip. I occupied myself with plans for Thanksgiving, now just a few weeks away. I was going to make his favorite pecan pie, the one with bourbon in the filling that his mother used to make. I thought about how nice it would be to have him home, to reconnect after this busy period. The irony tastes like metal in my mouth even now. I spent those evenings alone planning our holiday meal with a devotion that now seems pathetic. I made lists in my favorite notebook, the one with the William Morris print cover. What groceries to buy, which china to use, whether to invite the Hendersons from next door or keep it just family. I called Claire in Boston, and we discussed whether she'd bring her new boyfriend. I researched new stuffing recipes because Marcus had mentioned months ago that he wanted to try something different. I was trying to create a perfect Thanksgiving for a man who was already planning to leave me. The universe has a cruel sense of humor sometimes. I remember spending an entire evening researching the perfect cranberry sauce recipe, something with orange zest and a hint of cinnamon. I bookmarked at least a dozen different versions, comparing reviews and techniques. I thought about the table setting, whether to use the formal china we'd gotten as a wedding gift or the more casual pottery set I'd been collecting. Every detail mattered to me because I thought I was planning a celebration of our family, our life together. I didn't realize I was planning a funeral for a marriage that was already dead. Looking back, it's almost comical how much energy I poured into creating moments of connection with someone who was already mentally checked out, living a completely different life on a yacht with another woman. The text that changed everything came on day 6 of his trip. I was at the grocery store, debating between different types of apples for a tart I wanted to bake, when my phone buzzed. I want a divorce. Just like that. No preamble, no explanation, no phone call to soften the blow or explain himself like an adult after 3 decades of marriage. I stood there in the produce section of Mariano's, staring at those words until they blurred, until other shoppers had to navigate around me like I was some unfortunate obstacle in their path. An elderly woman asked if I was okay. I couldn't answer. My throat had closed up. My chest felt like someone had reached in and squeezed my heart with a fist made of ice. The fluorescent lights of the grocery store suddenly seemed too bright, harsh, and clinical. The piped-in music, some cheerful pop song, felt obscene against the backdrop of my disintegrating life. I was holding a Honeycrisp apple in one hand and my phone in the other, and I couldn't make sense of how these two realities existed in the same moment. Apples, divorce, grocery shopping, the end of my marriage. My hands started shaking so badly I dropped the apple. It rolled under the display, and I watched it go with a strange detachment, as if I was observing someone else's life falling apart instead of my own. I drove home in a fog of shock, so thick I'm amazed I didn't crash the car. I called him immediately, my hands shaking so badly I could barely hold the phone. It went straight to voicemail. I called again, and again, and again. 15 times I tried to reach him before I finally sent a text back. "What are you talking about? Marcus, please call me. We need to talk about this." The read receipt showed he'd seen it. No response. The silence was deafening, crushing, suffocating in its cruelty. The drive home is a blur of stop signs I barely remember stopping at and red lights that seem to last forever. Tears streamed down my face, and I kept wiping them away only to have more take their place. Other drivers must have thought I was insane. This middle-aged woman sobbing behind the wheel of her Volvo. At one point, I had to pull over because I couldn't see the road anymore. I sat in a random parking lot, gripping the steering wheel, trying to breathe through the panic attack that was threatening to consume me. My chest hurt, my vision tunneled. I genuinely thought I might be having a heart attack. Maybe I was, in a way. Maybe that's what a breaking heart actually feels like. Have you ever felt your entire reality shift beneath your feet? It's not like in the movies where everything goes into slow motion and there's dramatic music. It's mundane and horrible all at once. I sat at our kitchen table, the one we'd picked out together at an estate sale 15 years ago, and I couldn't breathe properly. Every object in that house suddenly felt like evidence of a lie. The wedding photos on the mantel, the vacation souvenirs from trips to Napa and Savannah and Charleston, the artwork we'd collected together, his reading glasses on the side table, his favorite coffee mug in the cabinet. All of it felt like props in a play I didn't know I was performing. I walked through our house like a stranger that afternoon, seeing everything with new eyes. In our bedroom, his closet still held rows of perfectly pressed shirts and suits. His cologne bottle sat on the dresser, half empty. The book he'd been reading before the trip lay on his nightstand, bookmarks still in place. All the physical evidence of a life he'd apparently already mentally abandoned. I opened his nightstand drawer, not sure what I was looking for. Contact solution, receipts for dry cleaning, a photograph of the two of us from our 20th anniversary trip to Paris, both of us smiling at the camera in front of the Eiffel Tower. I'd framed a copy of that photo that hung in our hallway. Had he been unhappy even then? How long had I been living with a ghost? That night, I didn't sleep. I paced our bedroom, my mind racing through every interaction we'd had in recent months, searching for clues I'd missed. Had he seemed distant? Yes, but he'd been stressed about work. Had our physical relationship cooled? Maybe, but we were in our 50s, and wasn't that normal? Had he criticized me more lately? I couldn't remember specific instances, but there was a general sense of his dissatisfaction I'd attributed to midlife restlessness. I'd convinced myself it would pass, that we just needed to reconnect, maybe take a vacation together. The cottage we'd talked about renting in Door County for a long weekend. I'd been looking forward to that. The hours between midnight and dawn are the worst for catastrophic thinking. I replayed conversations, analyzed his expressions in my memory, tortured myself with all the moments I should have questioned, but didn't. There was the time he'd snapped at me for asking about his day. The weekend he'd said he needed to work, but I'd driven by his office and his car wasn't there. The new clothes he'd bought, more stylish than his usual conservative choices. The way he'd started going to the gym religiously after years of making excuses. I'd thought he was having a healthy midlife realization about fitness. Now I realized he'd been getting in shape for her. The memory that haunted me most that night was from about 6 months earlier. We'd been at a dinner party at the Andersons, friends from his firm. I'd noticed Marcus checking his phone constantly throughout the evening, smiling at the screen in a way I hadn't seen him smile at me in years. When I'd asked him about it later in the car, he'd gotten defensive, said it was just work emails, asked why I was suddenly so suspicious. He'd turned it around on me, made me feel guilty for noticing his behavior. That's textbook gaslighting, but I didn't recognize it at the time. I'd apologized for questioning him, for making him uncomfortable. I'd actually apologized to my husband for catching him texting his mistress. The humiliation of that memory still burns. And there were other moments too, ones that seemed insignificant at the time, but took on new meaning in the harsh light of his betrayal. The way he'd started working late more often, always with plausible explanations about deadlines and difficult clients. The business trips that seemed to multiply, taking him away for longer stretches. The gradual emotional distance that I'd chalked up to the natural evolution of a long marriage. We'd stopped having those long conversations over dinner, stopped sharing our days in any meaningful way. He'd become vague about his work, his schedule, his life, And I'd let it happen because I trusted him, because I thought that's just what happened when you'd been married for 3 decades. You gave each other space. You developed separate lives. I didn't realize that separate lives was just code for he was living an entirely different existence that didn't include me. I called his assistant the next morning, trying to keep my voice steady. "Hi, Jennifer. I'm so sorry to bother you, but I've been having trouble reaching Marcus. Could you give me the name of his hotel in Seattle? I need to get in touch about a family matter." There was a pause on the other end of the line, long enough that my stomach dropped. "Mrs. Harrison, I'm not sure what you mean. Mr. Harrison isn't in Seattle. He took personal time off this week. He said it was a private matter and asked me to clear his schedule." The words hit me like a physical blow. Personal time? Private matter. He'd lied about the entire trip. Jennifer's confusion was audible through the phone. I could hear her clicking through what I assumed was his calendar, the sound of her trying to reconcile my question with whatever information she had. He did mention something about Seattle in the context of a future proposal, but that meeting isn't until next month. This week, he specifically requested off. I just assumed. She trailed off, and I could hear the moment she realized she might have just revealed something she shouldn't have. "Mrs. Harrison, is everything all right? Should I be concerned?" I told her everything was fine, thanked her, and hung up before my voice could crack. But everything was not fine. Everything was a carefully constructed lie, and I just glimpsed the scaffolding holding it up. My hands were shaking as I opened my laptop and logged into our bank accounts. We'd always had joint finances, complete transparency, or so I'd thought. Marcus handled most of the investments and business accounts because he was better with numbers, but I could see everything if I wanted to. I just never had reason to look closely before. What I found made my blood run cold. Withdrawals, large ones. 50,000 here, 30,000 there. Money moved from our joint savings into an account I didn't recognize. The transactions went back months, a slow bleed of our wealth that I'd been completely blind to. I sat there staring at the screen, scrolling through months of transactions with growing horror. The money hadn't disappeared all at once. That would have been too obvious. Might have triggered alerts or caught my attention during my occasional glance at the accounts. No, this was methodical, strategic. 5,000 here for what was labeled business development. 10,000 there for consulting expenses. 20,000 marked as investment opportunity. The descriptions were vague enough to seem legitimate if you weren't looking closely, but specific enough to avoid suspicion. And they all went to an account at a bank I'd never heard of, some online institution that specialized in, I would later learn, exactly the kind of privacy people seeking to hide money desired. I want you to understand something. I'm not a stupid woman. I have a master's degree in art history from Northwestern. I ran a successful gallery before I married Marcus and decided to focus on raising our daughter Claire, who's now 26 and living in Boston with her own career. I managed our household, our social calendar, volunteered on boards, organized charity events. I was competent and intelligent in every area of my life, except apparently in recognizing when my husband was systematically dismantling our marriage and stealing our money. The gallery I'd run was in Wicker Park, back before the neighborhood became trendy and expensive. I'd specialized in emerging artists, had an eye for talent that would later become successful. I'd sold pieces that now hung in major collections, had been profiled in local arts publications, had built something I was proud of from nothing. But when Claire was born, Marcus had suggested I step back. Just for a few years, he'd said, just until she was in school. Those few years became permanent when his career took off, and the money from his work dwarfed anything I could make from the gallery. It made financial sense to let my career go, he'd argued, and I'd agreed, because that's what you did in a partnership. You made sacrifices for the greater good. Except now I realized that only I had been sacrificing. He'd been building his empire while I'd been building his home. The second week crawled by in a haze of unanswered calls and ignored texts. I swung wildly between grief and rage, sometimes crying so hard I thought I might vomit, other times feeling nothing at all, just a hollow numbness that was almost worse than the pain. I told Claire what was happening, and she was ready to fly home immediately, ready to confront her father with the fury only a daughter can muster. I asked her to wait, told her I needed to understand what was happening before we made any moves. The truth was, I was still in denial, still hoping this was some kind of breakdown he was having that we could fix. Claire's voice over the phone had been shaking with rage. "Mom, what do you mean, wait? He texted you asking for a divorce and then ghosted you. There's nothing to understand. He's being a coward and an asshole, and I'm coming home to tell him that to his face." She was crying. I could hear it in her voice, and that broke my heart almost as much as Marcus's betrayal. Our daughter shouldn't have to deal with her parents' marriage falling apart. She was supposed to be focused on her career, on her own life, not flying home to manage her mother's crisis. I talked her down, promised I would keep her updated, made her swear she wouldn't try to contact her father yet. I needed time to think, to plan, to figure out what came next. I just didn't know yet that what came next would be war. My best friend Rachel came over every day that week. She'd known Marcus almost as long as I had celebrated our wedding, held my hand through difficult times. She sat with me at that kitchen table and let me talk in circles, cry into her shoulder, rage against the unfairness of it all. "You need a lawyer," she kept saying gently. "Sarah, you need to protect yourself." But I wasn't ready. I was still stuck in the fantasy that he'd come home, explain everything, and we'd figure out how to repair whatever had broken. Love doesn't make you blind. It makes you hopeful beyond all reason. Rachel brought food I couldn't eat and wine I drank too much of. She stayed overnight when I couldn't bear to be alone in the house. She listened to me rehearse the same questions over and over. Why would he do this? What did I do wrong? How did I miss it? She was patient in a way I wouldn't have been if our positions were reversed. On the fourth day, she sat me down and said something I'll never forget. "Sarah, you're asking the wrong questions. You didn't do anything wrong. He did. He chose this, and you need to stop trying to understand his choices and start making your own. Choose yourself for once. Choose to fight back." Her words didn't fully sink in at that moment. I was still too deep in shock, too consumed by grief to think about fighting back. But she planted a seed that would eventually grow into the determination I needed. Rachel had been through her own divorce years earlier, though hers had been more amicable, more straightforward. Her ex-husband had been honest about falling out of love, and they'd divided their assets fairly and moved on with their lives. She'd rebuilt and found happiness again. But she could see that my situation was different, darker, more insidious. "This isn't just a marriage ending," she told me. "This is betrayal on multiple levels. Financial, emotional, the lies, the disrespect of how he's doing it. You need to protect yourself, Sarah. You need to fight like your life depends on it, because in a way, it does." I spent hours during those days just staring at nothing, my mind unable to process the enormity of what was happening. The house felt different, like the walls themselves knew that the life they'd contained was over. Every room held memories that now felt tainted. The kitchen where we'd cooked together in the early years. The living room where we'd watched Claire take her first steps. The bedroom where we'd made love and shared our dreams and held each other through difficult times. All of it felt like a museum of lies now. How much of it had been real? How much had he been pretending even back then? Or had there been a time when he genuinely loved me, and I just missed the moment when that love died? It was Rachel who found the Instagram post. She'd been doing some digital detective work, something I didn't have the emotional strength for, and she'd stumbled onto a public profile. A woman named Victoria Chen, 38 years old according to her bio, who described herself as a lifestyle and travel influencer. Her feed was full of yacht photos, luxury hotels, designer shopping bags, and champagne toasts at sunset. And there, in a post from 4 days ago, was Marcus. My Marcus. Standing on the deck of a massive yacht somewhere tropical, his arm around her waist, both of them laughing at something off camera. The caption read, "New adventures with my favorite person. Life is beautiful when you're with the right one." I stared at that photo until my eyes burned. The right one. After 30 years of marriage, after building a life together, after everything we'd been through, I was the wrong one. And this woman, this stranger who looked young enough to be our daughter, she was the right one. The yacht, the tropical location, the luxury, it all came from our money, from the fortune we'd built together. My inheritance from my parents had gone into our joint accounts. My work, my sacrifices, my years of supporting his career while putting my own ambitions aside, it had all funded this betrayal. Victoria was beautiful in that calculated Instagram way. Perfect makeup, perfect hair, perfect body showcased in designer swimwear. Her feed was a highlight reel of privilege and excess, each photo more glamorous than the last. Helicopter rides over crystal blue water. Michelin-starred restaurants, first-class travel, shopping sprees in Paris and Milan. And through it all, comments from followers gushing about her perfect life, her goals, her living the dream. My money was funding her dream while my own was crumbling. I scrolled back through her posts, and Marcus appeared in several over the past few months. A dinner in New York, a weekend in Miami, a spa retreat in Arizona. All times he'd told me he was on business trips, all lies, all documented in public for anyone to see except the wife who was too trusting to think to look. That was the moment something inside me broke and reformed into something harder. The grief was still there, a constant ache in my chest, but it was joined by something cold and calculating. If he wanted to throw away our marriage for a woman half his age and a fantasy life funded by stolen money, fine. But I wasn't going to make it easy. I wasn't going to roll over and let him walk away with everything while I picked up the pieces alone. A betrayal this deep doesn't heal. It scars over. And sometimes those scars make you stronger than you ever were before. I made 2 phone calls that changed everything. The first was to Diana Rothstein, the most ruthless divorce attorney in Chicago. Her reputation preceded her. She'd represented women in some of the city's most high-profile divorces and had a track record of destroying unfaithful husbands in court. Her retainer alone was $20,000, money I withdrew from our joint account before Marcus could move any more of it. The second call was to a private investigator named Mike Torres that Diana recommended. If Marcus thought he could hide his new life from me, he was about to learn a very expensive lesson. Diana's office was in a gleaming high-rise downtown, all glass and steel and expensive furniture that screamed success. She was in her late 50s, impeccably dressed in a charcoal suit, and she didn't waste time with pleasantries. "Tell me everything," she said, and I did. Every detail, every withdrawal, every ignored phone call, the Instagram posts, the lies about Seattle. She took notes with a gold pen, her expression growing harder with each revelation. "He's been planning this for months," she said finally. "The money transfers, the secret accounts, this isn't impulsive. This is calculated. But here's the good news. Illinois is an equitable distribution state, and infidelity matters. We're going to make him pay for every lie." Her confidence was like armor I desperately needed. She laid out a strategy that was both comprehensive and aggressive. First, we'd freeze assets to prevent any further transfers. Then we'd file for divorce with a detailed accounting of his financial misconduct. We'd subpoena his bank records, his credit card statements, his phone records. We'd build an airtight case of fraud and betrayal that no judge could ignore. "I need you to be strong through this," Diana said, looking me directly in the eyes. "It's going to get ugly. He's going to fight back. His lawyer is going to try to paint you as bitter and vindictive. Can you handle that?" I thought about Victoria's Instagram post, about Marcus's cowardly text message, about 30 years reduced to a brush-off. "I can handle anything," I told her, and I meant it. Mike Torres looked nothing like I expected a private investigator to look. He was a former Chicago PD detective in his early 60s, grandfatherly and kind, with tired eyes that had seen too much. But Diana swore he was the best, and I needed the best. "I need to know everything," I told him. "Where he is, what he's doing, who this woman really is. I need evidence of everything." Mike nodded slowly. I understand you're hurt, Mrs. Harrison, and you have every right to be. But I need you to prepare yourself. What I find might hurt more than what you already know. Are you sure you want to go down this road? I didn't hesitate. I'm sure. Mike had a way of making you feel simultaneously comforted and cautious. He explained his process in detail. He'd start with public records and social media, then move to surveillance if needed. He had contacts who could help with financial investigations. He was thorough and methodical, qualities I desperately needed. Most of my clients think they want to know everything, he said, but sometimes the details are harder to live with than the general knowledge of betrayal. Photos, videos, specific conversations, they stay with you. I just want to make sure you're prepared for that. I appreciated his honesty, but my mind was made up. I needed the full truth, no matter how much it hurt. Living with uncertainty was worse than living with painful facts. The investigation took 2 weeks, and what Mike uncovered was worse than I'd imagined. Marcus wasn't in Seattle. He was on a yacht in the Caribbean with Victoria, a boat that cost $15,000 a day to charter. But it got worse. Victoria wasn't just some random woman he'd met. She was a former client from his consulting firm, someone he'd been working with for over a year. The affair had been going on for at least 8 months based on credit card records Mike had obtained, hotel rooms in various cities, expensive dinners, jewelry purchases. He'd been living a double life with precision and planning that would have been impressive if it wasn't so devastating. But here's where it gets truly twisted. And I need you to hear this carefully, because it's important. Victoria had been married too. Her divorce had finalized just 3 months ago, right around the time Marcus ramped up his money transfers out of our accounts. Mike had managed to track down her ex-husband, a tech entrepreneur named David, who was more than willing to talk. They'd met for coffee, and what David told him made my blood boil. Victoria had a pattern. She targeted wealthy, successful men, typically older and married, and convinced them to leave their wives. She'd done it before, at least twice that David knew of. This wasn't a love story. This was a con, and my husband was too blind with midlife crisis to see it. David had agreed to meet Mike at a coffee shop in the Loop, and Mike had recorded their conversation with David's permission. Listening to that recording was surreal. David's voice was bitter, but also sympathetic. I tried to warn the guy she was with after me, he said. Her next victim, I guess you'd call him. But he didn't want to hear it. Thought I was just a jealous ex. By the time he figured it out, she'd already taken him for $500,000. He described Victoria's playbook: love bombing, isolation from friends and family, encouraging major financial decisions, creating urgency around commitment. She's good, David admitted. She makes you feel like you're the most important person in the world, like she finally sees the real you that your wife never appreciated. It's intoxicating. And by the time you realize it's all manipulation, she's got access to your accounts, and you're in too deep. I sat in my living room reading Mike's full report, and I felt something I hadn't felt in weeks: power. Knowledge is power. And I now knew more about Marcus's plans than he realized. He thought he was in control, thought he could discard me like yesterday's news and sail off into the sunset with his trophy girlfriend. But he'd underestimated me. He'd underestimated the woman who'd stood beside him for 3 decades, who'd supported every career move, who'd sacrificed her own dreams to build his. That was his first mistake. His second was assuming I'd go quietly. Diana filed for divorce the next day, and we made sure Marcus was served in the most public way possible. Mike had tracked him to a restaurant in Turks and Caicos, where he was having dinner with Victoria and several other couples. The process server walked right up to their table, called out his name, and handed him the papers in front of everyone. Mike had someone there to photograph the moment. Marcus's face going pale, Victoria's confusion, the other diners watching the drama unfold. It was beautiful. It was the first crack in the perfect facade he'd been building. The restaurant was one of those exclusive places that doesn't even have prices on the menu, the kind where everything is market price, and a bottle of wine costs more than some people's monthly rent. The photos Mike's associate captured were perfect. Marcus in a linen shirt that I didn't recognize, clearly new and expensive. Victoria in a dress that probably cost thousands, her hand on his arm. Other couples at nearby tables pretending not to stare while obviously watching every moment of the drama. And Marcus's expression, shock, then anger, then something that might have been fear. The fantasy was crashing into reality in the most public way possible, and I felt not an ounce of sympathy. Play stupid games, win stupid prizes, as they say. The phone calls started immediately after, first from Marcus, angry and defensive. I didn't answer. Then from his lawyer, trying to negotiate. Diana handled that. Then from Marcus again, this time pleading, asking me to please be reasonable, to please not make this ugly. I actually laughed when I heard that voicemail. Don't make it ugly? He'd made it ugly when he abandoned our marriage for a con artist and our money for a fantasy life. But I sent him a single text in response. See you in court. You might wonder if I felt guilty for what I was about to do. The truth is, I felt nothing but cold determination. Scientific studies reveal that abuse victims are 2.3 times more likely to have depression 3 years later, and emotional abuse is abuse, make no mistake. The gaslighting, the lies, the financial manipulation, the abandonment, all of it was a form of cruelty I wouldn't have believed my husband capable of until I'd lived it. I'd spent weeks doubting myself, wondering what I'd done wrong, how I'd failed him. But sitting there with a file full of evidence of his calculated betrayal, I realized I hadn't failed anyone. He had. The preliminary hearing was set for 3 weeks out, and in that time, I became someone I barely recognized. I documented everything. I changed all our passwords. I secured our joint assets as much as I could. I gathered 30 years of financial records, showing my contributions to our wealth, both my inheritance and the income I'd earned before setting aside my career. I collected emails, texts, anything that showed the timeline of his affair and his financial deception. Diana was impressed. "You're a natural at this," she said with something like admiration. "He doesn't stand a chance." I became obsessed with building the case. I spent hours at the kitchen table with file folders spread around me, creating timelines and documenting evidence. I found old tax returns showing my income from the gallery before I'd closed it. I found the deposit slips from when I'd added my inheritance to our joint accounts, money my parents had left me that was supposed to secure our retirement. I found emails from years ago where Marcus had praised my sacrifice in closing the gallery, had promised that we were building our future together. Every piece of evidence was another nail in the coffin of his defense. Rachel would come over and find me surrounded by papers, and she'd make me eat something, remind me to sleep. But I was driven by something beyond basic needs. I was driven by the need for justice. The documentation process became almost therapeutic in its way. Every transaction I uncovered, every lie I could prove, gave me a sense of control I desperately needed. I created spreadsheets tracking his spending patterns over the past 2 years. I noticed that the expensive purchases had started around 18 months ago, right when he must have met Victoria. Designer handbags I'd never seen him give me. Jewelry from Tiffany's that had never appeared on my finger. Hotel stays in cities he'd claimed were just day trips. Charges at high-end restaurants during times he'd told me he was working through lunch. The pattern was clear once I started looking for it. He'd been spending our money to court another woman while I sat at home planning our retirement. I found credit card statements showing purchases I'd never questioned at the time. $1,000 at La Perla, the luxury lingerie store. I'd never received anything from there. $500 at a florist, on a day that wasn't my birthday or our anniversary. $2,000 at a spa I'd never visited. He'd been spending freely, confident I'd never look closely enough to question him. And he'd been right for a long time. I'd trusted him completely with our finances. That trust had been my biggest mistake, and I was determined it wouldn't be my downfall. But Marcus wasn't going down without a fight. His lawyer, a slick corporate type named Jonathan Breslow, filed motion after motion trying to delay proceedings, trying to claim I was being vindictive and unreasonable. They wanted mediation. They wanted a quiet settlement. They wanted to avoid the public spectacle of a trial. Diana shut down every attempt with precision that was poetry to watch. "Your client committed adultery and financial fraud," she wrote in one response. "My client wants her day in court. We'll see you there." The texts from Marcus got increasingly desperate. He called me vindictive, cruel, heartless. He said I was destroying his happiness, that Victoria made him feel alive in ways I never had, that he deserved a second chance at love. Each message revealed more of the man I'd been married to, and each one made me more certain I was doing the right thing. This wasn't the man I'd fallen in love with. Maybe that man never existed. Maybe I'd been in love with a carefully constructed image, while the real Marcus was always this selfish, this cruel, this willing to discard people when they no longer served his purposes. One text in particular stood out. It came late at night, and I could tell he'd been drinking from the rambling nature of it. "You never understood me, Sarah. You never saw who I really was. You were content with your little museum volunteer work and your pottery classes, but I needed more. I needed someone who matched my ambition, who understood what I was building. Victoria gets it. She gets me. Why can't you just let me be happy?" I read that message 3 times, and each time it made me angrier. I'd given up a career I loved to support his ambitions. I'd managed our home, raised our daughter, hosted his business dinners, played the perfect corporate wife while he built his empire. And he had the audacity to say, I didn't understand ambition. The lack of self-awareness was staggering. Then came the most stunning piece of information Mike uncovered, and this is where the story takes a turn that still makes me sick to my stomach. Remember how I told you Victoria had a pattern? Well, Mike found out why. She had a business partner, a man named Kyle, who specialized in identity theft and financial fraud. Together, they'd been running a long con targeting wealthy men in midlife crises. Victoria would seduce them, convince them to leave their wives, encourage them to move assets into accounts she had access to, and then once the divorce was final and the money was secured, she'd disappear. Kyle would handle the financial end, moving money through shell corporations and offshore accounts until it was untraceable. They'd done it successfully at least 3 times before Marcus. I sat across from Diana and Mike in her conference room as they laid out the evidence. Bank records, email communications between Victoria and Kyle, testimony from David, Victoria's ex-husband, who confirmed he'd lost over $2 million to the scheme before he'd figured it out too late. Marcus wasn't having an affair. He was being systematically robbed by professionals, and he was too besotted to see it. "We need to report this to the FBI," Mike said. "This is wire fraud, money laundering, organized crime." But Diana held up a hand. "First, we use this in divorce court. We protect Sarah's assets. Then we can decide about criminal charges." The emails Mike had obtained were damning. In one, Victoria wrote to Kyle, "The Mark is completely hooked. He's already moved $200K into the offshore account and thinks it's for our future together. He's talking about leaving his wife, which is perfect timing. Once the divorce is final, we can clean him out and move on to the next one." The casual cruelty of it, the way they discussed Marcus like he was just a transaction, would have been shocking if I had any sympathy left for him. But I didn't. He'd chosen this bed, and now he could lie in it. Here's where I made a choice that some might judge me for, but I need you to understand my reasoning. I could have warned Marcus. I could have called him, told him he was being conned, saved him from losing everything to criminals, but why would I? He'd chosen this. He'd chosen to betray me, to lie to me, to steal from our joint accounts to fund his fantasy. If Victoria and Kyle took him for every penny, wasn't that just karma? Besides, warning him would tip off the criminals, and I wanted evidence for court. I wanted everyone to see what he'd done, who he'd done it for, and what he'd lost in the process. The divorce proceedings began in late November, and the courtroom was exactly as cold and impersonal as you'd imagine. Marcus showed up with Jonathan Breslow, looking tired and older than I'd ever seen him. He wouldn't meet my eyes. Victoria wasn't with him, which Mike later told me was because she'd suddenly become scarce once the legal proceedings started heating up. Smart of her. Criminals usually are. The judge was a woman in her 60s named Patricia Henley, known for her no-nonsense approach to divorce cases and her particular distaste for infidelity. The courtroom had that particular smell of old wood and nervous people that all courtrooms seem to have. I sat at the plaintiff's table with Diana, my hands folded in my lap to keep them from shaking. Marcus sat 20 feet away, but it might as well have been miles. We were strangers now, adversaries in a legal battle that would determine the financial terms of dismantling our shared life. I'd dressed carefully that morning, choosing a navy suit that was professional and understated. I wanted to look like the wronged party, not the vindictive ex-wife his lawyer would try to paint me as. Diana had coached me on courtroom demeanor. Stay calm, don't react visibly to anything said. Let the evidence speak for itself. Diana opened with a presentation that was devastating in its thoroughness. She showed the timeline of Marcus's affair, the financial transfers, the lies about business trips, the chartered yacht, the jewelry purchases, the hotel rooms in a dozen different cities. She showed his income, our combined net worth, my contributions both financial and domestic over 30 years. She showed the prenup we'd signed decades ago that he thought would protect him, but that actually had an infidelity clause he'd apparently forgotten about. One by one, she dismantled every defense he could possibly mount. Then came my testimony. I'd been dreading this, having to sit there and recount the most painful period of my life for strangers. But Diana had prepared me well. She asked me about our marriage, about my career sacrifices, about the moment I received the text message asking for divorce. I kept my voice steady, but I let the emotion show. I wasn't acting. The pain was real. The betrayal was real. When she asked me how I felt when I discovered the affair, I looked directly at Marcus for the first time. I felt like 30 years of my life had been erased, I said. Like I'd been replaced by a newer model and discarded like I meant nothing. The cross-examination from Jonathan Breslow was brutal, but I was ready for it. He tried to paint me as a vindictive ex-wife who couldn't accept that the marriage was over. He questioned my contributions to our wealth, suggested I'd been living off Marcus's success for years. Diana objected repeatedly, and Judge Henley sustained most of them. But Breslow kept pushing, kept trying to make me seem unreasonable. Mrs. Harrison, isn't it true that you and your husband had grown apart over the years? That the marriage had been struggling long before this trip? I looked at him calmly. If it had been struggling, I wasn't aware of it. Maybe you should ask your client why he never mentioned he was unhappy before he drained our bank accounts and ran off with another woman. Then came the moment I'd been waiting for. Diana called Mike Torres to the stand, and he presented his findings about Victoria and Kyle's operation. The courtroom went silent as he laid out the con, the pattern, the previous victims. He showed email exchanges he'd uncovered through his investigation, communications between Victoria and Kyle discussing Marcus specifically, how much they thought they could get from him, how easy he was to manipulate. She calls him her golden goose in these messages, Mike said, his voice heavy with disgust. She's not in love with him, she's robbing him, and he's letting her do it. Marcus's face went from pale to gray. You could see the exact moment it hit him, the realization that everything he'd thrown away his marriage for was a lie. His lawyer called for a recess, and they huddled in urgent conversation. Victoria still hadn't appeared, and according to Mike's latest update, she'd stopped returning Marcus's calls 2 days ago. The con was collapsing, and she was getting out before the law caught up with her. But the damage to Marcus was done. The judge had seen the evidence. The court had heard the testimony. There was no coming back from this. When we reconvened, Jonathan Breslow tried to pivot, tried to argue that Marcus was a victim too, that he'd been manipulated and deserved sympathy rather than punishment. Judge Henley's expression could have frozen water. "Counselor," she said, her voice sharp as a blade, "your client chose to betray his wife of 30 years. He chose to move marital assets without her knowledge or consent. He chose to lie and deceive. That he chose to do all of this for a woman who was conning him doesn't make him a victim. It makes him a fool." The gallery, filled with people waiting for other cases, actually gasped. It was the most satisfying sound I'd ever heard. The settlement that Judge Henley ordered was everything Diana had hoped for and more. Marcus was ordered to return every penny he'd transferred from our joint accounts, plus interest. I was awarded 70% of our marital assets, including our home, due to the infidelity clause in our prenup and his financial misconduct. He was ordered to pay my legal fees, which had climbed well into 6 figures. His retirement accounts were to be divided with me receiving the larger share. The judge was particularly cutting in her ruling. Mr. Harrison's conduct demonstrates a pattern of deception and financial abuse. The court finds that he violated the marital contract in the most fundamental ways and will be held fully accountable. But the courtroom drama wasn't quite over. As we were gathering our things to leave, Marcus finally approached me. His lawyer tried to stop him, but he shook him off. We stood there in the hallway outside the courtroom, and for the first time in months, we were face to face. He looked destroyed, and I felt nothing. That's what surprised me most. No satisfaction, no vindication, just emptiness where love used to be. "Sarah," he said, his voice breaking, "I'm so sorry. You were right about everything. Victoria's gone. She took everything I moved into those accounts. I've lost it all. I was such a fool." I looked at the man I'd spent 3 decades with and saw a stranger. A pathetic, broken stranger who'd gambled everything on a fantasy and lost. "Yes," I said simply. "You were." He actually started crying right there in the courthouse hallway. Tears running down his face, shoulders shaking. "Please," he said. "Can we talk? Can we try to work something out? I made a terrible mistake, but we could start over, couldn't we? We have history. We have a daughter. We could rebuild." And that's when I felt it. Not anger, not hatred, but pity. He'd lost everything for nothing. His marriage, his money, his dignity, his future. And he still didn't understand that some bridges, once burned, can never be rebuilt. "No, Marcus," I said quietly. "We can't. You didn't just break my heart. You broke my trust, my security, my sense of reality. You made me doubt myself, question my worth, wonder what was wrong with me. And you did all of that while lying to my face every single day. I could forgive a lot of things, but I can't forgive that. I won't forgive that. You made your choice. Now you get to live with it." I turned and walked away, and I didn't look back. Rachel was waiting for me by the elevator, and she wrapped me in a hug as the doors closed. "You did it," she whispered. "You really did it." I had, and it felt like emerging from underwater after being held down for months. The legal victory was satisfying, but the real work was just beginning. I had to rebuild my life from the ground up. The first thing I did was completely redecorate our brownstone. Every room that held memories of Marcus got transformed. New paint, new furniture, new art. I didn't want to live in a museum of our failed marriage. I wanted a home that was mine, that reflected who I was becoming rather than who I'd been. The guest room became my art studio. I'd given up painting when Claire was born, and I decided it was time to reclaim that passion. The process of redecorating was surprisingly therapeutic. I spent weeks choosing paint colors, something Marcus had always insisted on controlling. He liked neutrals, beiges, and grays that were safe and boring, I chose deep blues and warm terracottas and a sage green for the kitchen that made the whole room feel alive. I donated his furniture to charity and bought pieces that I loved, not pieces that matched some corporate aesthetic he preferred. The living room got a velvet sofa in peacock blue, artwork from local artists I'd discovered at gallery shows. My bedroom became a sanctuary with soft linens and plants and a reading nook by the window. Each change felt like reclaiming territory, like making the space mine again. The first piece of furniture I got rid of was the leather recliner Marcus had insisted on keeping in the living room, despite it clashing with everything else. It was ugly and masculine and dominated the space in a way that had always bothered me, but he'd refused to consider replacing it. The day the donation truck took it away, I felt lighter. I replaced it with a vintage chaise lounge I found at an estate sale, upholstered in a dusty rose velvet that made me smile every time I looked at it. It was impractical and feminine and absolutely perfect. I hung artwork that Marcus had vetoed over the years, an abstract piece with bold reds and oranges that he'd called too aggressive, a series of botanical prints that he'd dismissed as too cottage-like, a large mirror with an ornate gold frame that he'd said was too much. I filled the house with things that made me happy without having to consider anyone else's opinion. Fresh flowers every week from the farmer's market, scented candles in fragrances I loved, throw pillows in patterns and textures that delighted me. The house transformed from a space that reflected our compromise into a space that reflected me. And in transforming the house, I was transforming myself. I threw myself into therapy too, not because I was broken, but because I wanted to understand what had happened, how I'd missed the signs, how to protect myself better in the future. My therapist, Dr. Ellen Kramer, was brilliant at helping me untangle the web of guilt and shame I'd wrapped myself in. "You keep saying you should have known," she pointed out one session. "But Sarah, abusers and liars are good at what they do. That's why it works. You trusted your husband because that's what marriage is supposed to be built on. He violated that trust. That's on him, not you." Those therapy sessions became a lifeline in ways I hadn't anticipated. Dr. Kramer helped me see patterns I'd normalized over the years. The way Marcus had gradually taken control of our finances, framing it as helping me rather than excluding me. The way he'd made me feel guilty for having my own interests and friendships. Subtle comments about how I was always off with my museum friends or my pottery class instead of home when he needed me. Never mind that he was traveling constantly for work. The double standard had been there all along, but I'd made excuses for it. We worked through my tendency to blame myself, to search for what I'd done wrong to drive him away. Dr. Kramer was patient but firm in redirecting that narrative. "You could have been the perfect wife by every possible measure, and he still would have done this," she told me. "Because this isn't about you failing. This is about his character, his choices, his willingness to betray someone who loved and trusted him. You can't prevent someone else's betrayal by being good enough. That's not how it works." Slowly, painfully, I started to believe her. We also talked about rebuilding my sense of self outside of being Marcus's wife. I'd spent 30 years defining myself through that relationship, and now I had to figure out who Sarah was on her own. It was terrifying and liberating in equal measure. Dr. Kramer encouraged me to think about what I'd given up over the years, what dreams I'd set aside, what parts of myself I'd shrunk to fit into the role of supportive wife. The list was longer than I'd expected, and acknowledging it was both painful and empowering. Claire came home for Thanksgiving, and we had the most honest conversation we'd ever had. She was furious at her father, hadn't spoken to him since the divorce was finalized. But she was also worried about me, afraid I'd become bitter and closed off. "Mom," she said as we sat in the kitchen making pie together, "I need you to promise me something. Promise me you won't let what Dad did make you stop believing in love." I thought about that carefully. "I don't think I've stopped believing in love," I told her. "I've stopped believing in the fairy tale that love conquers all, that commitment means forever regardless of how you're treated. I've learned that loving yourself has to come first, and that's not selfish. That's survival." We spent that Thanksgiving together, just the two of us, creating new traditions in the wake of the old ones that had died. We made a completely different menu than what I'd planned for Marcus. No pecan pie, no traditional turkey. Instead, we ordered Thai food and watched movies and talked late into the night about everything. About her relationship and what she'd learned from watching our marriage fall apart. About her fears of repeating my mistakes. About how to recognize red flags and trust your instincts. About the importance of maintaining your independence even when you love someone. "I always thought you and Dad were the gold standard," Claire admitted. "You seemed so solid, so comfortable together. Finding out it was all a lie has really messed with my head. How do I trust that my own relationship is real?" I understood her fear completely. "You trust yourself," I told her. "You stay aware. You don't ignore your gut feelings. You maintain your own identity and your own resources. You love fully, but you don't love blindly. And you remember that someone else's betrayal doesn't mean love itself is a lie. It just means that person wasn't capable of real love." Seeing my daughter process her own feelings about the divorce was heartbreaking. She'd lost her family structure, her sense of who her father was, her template for what a marriage should look like. But she was also fiercely protective of me in a way that made me proud. She'd called her father exactly once after everything came out, and from what she told me, she'd eviscerated him with a precision that would have made Diana proud. I told him he was a coward and a liar, and that he'd destroyed the person who loved him most for a con artist and a fantasy, she said. He tried to make excuses, tried to explain about Victoria and how she made him feel. I hung up on him. I haven't answered his calls since. The look in her eyes was pure steel. She was my daughter in more ways than one. The news about Victoria and Kyle eventually broke in the media. The FBI had been investigating them for months, it turned out, and Marcus's case was just one piece of a much larger puzzle. They'd conned at least 7 men out of a combined total of over $15 million. When they finally arrested Kyle in Miami, Victoria was long gone, probably somewhere overseas, with a new identity and a new target. Marcus would never see his money again. The federal prosecutor asked if I wanted to testify at Kyle's trial, and I declined. I'd spent enough time and energy on that nightmare. I wanted to focus on moving forward. I started dating again about a year after the divorce was finalized. Nothing serious, just coffee dates and dinners, reminding myself what it felt like to have conversations with men who were interested in me as a person. It was strange and awkward and sometimes fun. I went out with a divorced professor who talked too much about his ex-wife, a widower who was lovely but still clearly grieving, a never-married entrepreneur who was charming but ultimately too self-absorbed. I didn't mind that none of them turned into anything serious. I was relearning who I was as a single woman, and that required time and space. The dating process was educational in unexpected ways. I discovered what I actually wanted in a partner, now that I wasn't the naive 20-something who'd married Marcus. I wanted someone who saw me as an equal, not a support system for their ambitions. Someone who was genuinely interested in my thoughts and opinions, not just looking for an audience for their own. Someone who was financially responsible and transparent, who understood that trust is built through consistent honesty. Someone who had done their own emotional work and wasn't looking for me to fix them or complete them. I also discovered what I wouldn't tolerate anymore. Any hint of controlling behavior was an immediate deal breaker. Any suggestion that I should be less of myself to accommodate them. Any expectation that I should manage their emotions or make myself smaller. I'd spent 30 years molding myself to fit Marcus's needs, and I was done with that. If being fully myself meant being alone, I was completely okay with that. Better alone and authentic than partnered and diminished. The biggest surprise came when the Art Institute offered me a curator position. They'd seen the work I'd been doing as a volunteer, organizing exhibitions and writing catalog essays, and they wanted to bring me on staff. It was a dream opportunity, a chance to return to the career I'd set aside 30 years ago. I almost said no out of habit, The old Sarah who didn't want to be too ambitious, too demanding, too much. But the new Sarah, the one who'd fought for herself in divorce court and won, she said yes. She said yes with enthusiasm and confidence. She said yes because she deserved it. Now let me take a moment here to talk about something serious. Because if my story can help even one person avoid what I went through, then sharing it will have been worth it. What Marcus did to me wasn't just infidelity. It was financial abuse. It was emotional manipulation. It was gaslighting on a massive scale. And the signs were there if I'd known what to look for. The way he'd slowly taken over all our finances, convincing me he was better at managing money. The way he'd made me feel guilty for wanting to pursue my own career. The way he'd gradually isolated me from my own sense of financial security and independence. If you're in a relationship, any relationship, protect yourself financially. Have your own bank account. Know where all the money is and have access to it. Understand your joint assets and debts. Don't let anyone, no matter how much you love them, convince you that trusting them means giving up your own financial agency. In nursing homes, almost 1 in 6 residents reports experiencing abuse, and that's just the reported cases. Abuse takes many forms, and it can happen to anyone regardless of education, income, or social status. I had a master's degree and volunteered on boards, and I still got taken advantage of because I trusted too completely. Know your rights too. Understand what your state's divorce laws say about property division and alimony. Know what would happen if your marriage ended tomorrow. I'm not saying go into marriage planning for divorce, but I am saying that ignorance doesn't protect you. It just makes you vulnerable. If I'd known about that infidelity clause in our prenup, maybe I would have paid more attention when Marcus started traveling more. Maybe I would have asked harder questions instead of accepting easy lies. Watch for the red flags, sudden changes in behavior, unexplained absences, secretiveness about finances or phone usage, defensiveness when asked simple questions, gaslighting, when you express concerns, that feeling in your gut that something's wrong, even if you can't put your finger on what. Trust that feeling. Your intuition is your brain processing patterns you haven't consciously noticed yet. Mine was screaming at me for months, and I ignored it because I didn't want to seem paranoid or controlling. I wish I'd listened. And here's the hardest truth. Sometimes the people we love most are capable of hurting us the worst. Not because they're monsters, but because we've given them access to our most vulnerable selves. Marcus knew exactly how to manipulate me because he'd had 30 years to learn my weaknesses, my insecurities, my desperate desire to be a good wife. He used that knowledge against me, and that betrayal cut deeper than the affair ever could. Learning to trust again after that kind of violation is hard. Some days it still feels impossible, but I'm trying, one day at a time. So where am I now? 2 years post-divorce, living in my beautifully redecorated brownstone in Chicago, working at a job I love, rebuilding friendships I'd let slide during my marriage. I'm painting again. Actually sold 3 pieces last month at a local gallery show. I'm traveling, went to Italy last fall, and fell in love with Florence all over again. I'm learning to be comfortable being alone without being lonely. I'm discovering parts of myself that got buried under 30 years of being someone's wife. Do I regret the years with Marcus? That's complicated. I regret how it ended. I regret the lies and the betrayal and the way he made me doubt myself. But I don't regret Claire, our daughter who's become one of my closest friends. I don't regret the good memories we did make before it all went wrong. I don't regret who I became in the process of fighting for myself. That woman is stronger, wiser, and more authentically herself than I ever was in my marriage. In a twisted way, Marcus's betrayal forced me to become the person I was always meant to be. The truth is, I won. Not because I got a favorable divorce settlement or because I avoided getting conned like Marcus did. I won because I refused to let his betrayal destroy me. I won because I chose to rebuild rather than surrender to bitterness. I won because I'm happier now, alone in my authenticity, than I ever was pretending everything was perfect. and that's a victory no courtroom could ever award. But I want to be honest with you about something else. Some days are still hard. Some mornings I wake up and still reach for someone who isn't there before I remember. Some nights I hear a sound in the house and feel afraid in a way I never did when I was married. Some moments I wonder if I'm doing this whole life thing right, if I'm making the right choices, if I'm too damaged to ever really trust someone again. Healing isn't linear. It's messy and complicated and full of setbacks. Anyone who tells you otherwise is lying. The question I get asked most often is whether I'd ever get married again. My answer is simple. I don't know. I'm not opposed to it, but I'm also not looking for it. I spent 30 years defining myself through my relationship with someone else, and now I'm learning to be complete on my own. If someone comes along who adds to that completeness without trying to define it, great. If not, I'm okay with that too. I refuse to settle ever again. I refuse to make myself smaller to make someone else comfortable. I refuse to ignore red flags for the sake of maintaining an illusion of happiness. I know my worth now, and I won't accept anything less than what I deserve. To anyone listening who's going through something similar, who's discovered a betrayal, or facing a divorce, or questioning their entire reality, I want you to hear this. You're stronger than you think you are. I know it doesn't feel that way right now. I know you're probably barely holding it together, crying in the shower, putting on a brave face for the world while you're dying inside. I know because I was there. But you will survive this. You will come out the other side. And if you're willing to do the hard work of healing and growing and learning from it, you'll come out better than you were before. Document everything if you're going through a divorce. Get a good lawyer. Protect your assets. Don't let guilt or shame or the desire to be nice stop you from fighting for what you deserve. This isn't about being vindictive. This is about survival and justice. You wouldn't go into battle without armor, and divorce is absolutely a battle. Fight smart. Fight hard. And don't stop fighting until you've won. Take care of your mental health too. Get therapy. Join support groups. Talk to friends. Don't try to white-knuckle your way through trauma. I spent too many nights alone in that house convincing myself I could handle it on my own, and all it did was make everything harder. Asking for help isn't weakness. It's wisdom. Use every resource available to you, and don't be ashamed that you need them. And finally, remember that your story doesn't end with the betrayal. That's just one chapter, however painful. You get to write what comes next. You get to decide who you become in the aftermath. I chose strength. I chose growth. I chose to believe that I deserved better, and then I went out and built better for myself. You can too. It won't be easy, and it won't happen overnight, but it is possible. I'm living proof. So let me ask you, what would you have done in my shoes? Would you have warned Marcus about the con? Would you have fought as hard in court? Or would you have taken a different path entirely? Drop a comment and let me know where you're listening from and what you think. And if my story resonated with you, if you've been through something similar or you're going through it now, hit that like button. Let me know I'm not alone in this. Let me know that sharing the hardest parts of my life meant something to someone. Before I go, I want to remind you to subscribe to this channel if you haven't already. We share stories like mine every week. Real experiences from real people navigating the messy, complicated, beautiful disaster that is human relationships. And check out the videos on screen for more stories that might speak to you. One is about a woman who discovered her husband's secret family, and another is about a man who lost everything to a romance scam. You're not alone in whatever you're facing. There's a whole community here of people who understand. Until the next story, take care of your heart. Protect it fiercely, but don't let it harden completely. Stay open to possibility while being wise about risk. And remember, you deserve a love that builds you up rather than tears you down. You deserve honesty and respect and partnership. Don't settle for anything less, even if it means being alone for a while. Being alone is so much better than being in a relationship that slowly kills who you are. Thank you for listening to my story. Thank you for letting me share the worst and best parts of this journey with you. And remember, no matter what you're facing today, you're stronger than you think. You're going to make it through. And when you do, you might just discover that the person you become in the fire is worth everything you lost along the way. Take care, and I'll see you in the next video.